Now if you clicked on this video because of the title, then don't worry, this is a video games pickup video. If however it was the thumbnail that drew you in, well that may be slightly misleading. Not too much, let's call it 33% misleading, because it was all due to Jen, who decided to post this on my last video games pickups. Now who would have thought that Jen over at Retro Rivals had a problem with modern games? Not me for one, but this video here, this video game pickups video, is going to be, in Jen's honour, 90% complete retro. So if you're interested to see what retro games I picked up over the last few weeks, you just wait until after these.
Now as per normal, I will be showing you the newest games first and then working my way back to that juicy retro at the end. Of course, being a 90% retros video game pickups video, it won't take long to get to that juicy retro. So let's start the ball rolling with the first and only PlayStation 5 game that I picked up, Beyond a Steel Sky. Now Beyond a Steel Sky is sort of retro in a way because it's a long anticipated follow up to Beneath a Steel Sky, and it comes in this wonderful steelbook. Now what I like about this steelbook is the inside is decorated too. I really love it when companies go out their way to do little things like that. It makes it so much better. Don't mind if it's just a plain steelbook, it's got a nice slipcover, but when they go that extra mile, and it's a great point and click adventure too. Now that'll upset Tommy over at Dad and Lads Gaming, but tough. So next up we're moving down a generation and over to Nintendo, so the Switch, and the first Switch game that I picked up is the Wonder Boy collection. Now this obviously is also a kind of retro game because obviously it supports of the old games onto the new system. Now I didn't play Wonder Boy back in the day and I haven't played this collection yet, so I don't know whether or not there's any quality of life improvements in this particular port. But if you want to find out, then I'll direct you over to Retro Red Steve, his link will be in the description. He loves the Wonder Boy franchise. If there's a Wonder Boy game or port, he's played it. So pop over and see Steve and he'll probably be able to help you out with that. Next up, and still with the Nintendo Switch, we have a game that I absolutely had to pick up this year. It's just been released, it's another retro port. That game is none other than Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door. Now as I said, this is a game that I had to pick up, and the reason I had to pick it up is I played it last year for the first time and absolutely fell in love with it. Now it's not quite so easy or cheap for any stretch of the imagination to play the original game, but for Switch, or Nintendo anyway, to release this port, thumbs up to them. It's great to see Nintendo looking after their back catalogue and giving us these games again. Next up we're moving down a generation because I said this was going to be 90% retro, it might even be more than that, and we're moving over to Sony, the PlayStation 3, and the game that I picked up first was Disgaea 4. Now I've only ever dipped my toe gently into this particular franchise, but it is a strategy JRPG and it's my cup of tea. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I do love strategy RPGs, I love turn-based combat, obviously, I mean, if you've watched the channel you'll know that. But the Disgaea series, it's one that I want to get into, but I want to have them all in physical form and play them from the start. So Disgaea 4 into the collection. Next up, and still with the PlayStation 3. Now before we move on, the PlayStation 3 is not a retro console, not by any stretch of the imagination. Well, not to me anyway, and if you want to have that fight, then drop down into the comments and we'll have a good old chinwag about that. But still in the retro theme, the game that I picked up for the PlayStation 3 is Leisure Suit Larry, box office bust. Now you probably have to be of a certain age and you probably have to have a certain type of sense of humour to enjoy the Leisure Suit Larry games. I enjoyed them back in the late 80s, early 90s, and maybe they haven't aged well, or the themes haven't aged well. They have for me. I'll still sit down and have a giggle with them. Now I haven't played this one, I have played one on the PlayStation 2, but you know what, I'm going to give this one a go because it's Leisure Suit Larry, it's my type of sort of innuendo-y toilet humour, and it's in the collection now anyway. Next up, we're dropping down a generation. We're staying with Sony, so the PlayStation 2. And for me, the PlayStation 2 is a very, very fringe retro console. It's not quite retro enough for me. I'm sure a lot of you out there think it's deep into retro territory, but it's not for me. And the game that I picked up for it, Rayman 3. Now, I didn't play the Rayman games back in the day, and it wasn't really my kind of thing. This one, however, I had to pick up. It was in lovely condition. Not only that, it had this wonderful lenticular cover on the inside. Now, I've seen lenticular covers on slipcovers. I've seen the whole box art being lenticular cover. I have never before seen just this single card that can pop out. I'll put that back in later, set it aside, because it's a wonderful piece, quite like it, and I'm looking forward to playing Rayman 3 for the very first time. Next up, we're staying with the PlayStation 2, and still not quite too retro for me, and the game that I picked up was one that I've been after for a little while. It's one I've had my eye on, just never seen it out in the wild until recently, and that game is Killer 7. And like many other games that I pick up for the PlayStation 2, Killer 7 is a game I've never played before, never had. Just so fascinated by the concept of the game. You play as a hitman, you've got these 7 personalities that you can switch between. The art style is absolutely phenomenal. It's peak PlayStation 2. And you know what? Drop down in the comments and you can have a look at Heaps of Games. He's probably played this. I'm pretty sure he has played this. And if he hasn't, he's going to be watching this and he's going to want to play this now. But I'm absolutely sure he has played it. I picked it up because the condition was fantastic. It's been one that I've had my eye on for a while, so it's in the collection now. Next up, and still for the PlayStation 2, is pure nostalgia overload. Well, it's pure nostalgia overload for me, because the game that I saw out in the wild, one that I've also been looking for a while, just in getting good condition, is He-Man, Defenders of Grayskull, Masters of the Universe. I mean, just look at that. The artwork, it just takes you back to the 1980s, and it's just peak time. Peak time for cartoons. It was peak time for maybe not video games maybe 90s, but music, yes, cartoons definitely, and music without a doubt. It's in lovely condition. Now I know it's not going to be a great game. I'm pretty sure it was hammered quite badly by the critics, but it's He-Man, and who doesn't love a bit of He-Man? I love it. It's in the collection. I'm going to get it played because I like playing a bad game too. Next up, we're staying with the same generation but moving over to Sega, so that's, well, the Dreamcast, and I picked up Phantasy Star Online version 2. Now, I did love the original Phantasy Star games back in the day, but I never did get round to Phantasy Star Online because obviously I was a PlayStation kid. Now, one of the things that I really don't like about these Dreamcast boxes, the PAL or the European boxes, is they're so hard to open. Yes, they look quite substantial, they're quite chunky, they're lovely things, but opening them is an absolute nightmare, but it's in the collection now. Next up, we're dropping down a generation, moving back over to Sony, so obviously the Sony PlayStation, or the PS1 if you must, and the game that I picked up for the Sony PlayStation was Hugo 2. Now, to be completely honest, if you're living outside of the UK or Europe, you probably don't know who Hugo is. He was some sort of cartoon character back in maybe the late 80s, early 90s, but only over here in Europe. I think he's maybe German, Belgium, I don't know, Austrian, I don't know who this little guy is, but he's definitely a popular little character in Europe from that time period. Now, I don't have any nostalgia for Hugo, but when you see a PlayStation game out there in the wild and it's in great condition and very cheap, you want to bring it into your collection, so it's here now. Next up, and still with the Sony PlayStation, is a game that I do have a lot of nostalgia for. It's a game I spent a lot of time on, and a lot of time on not just with me, but with a lot of friends as well, and that is Micro Machines V3 or version 3. Now, I would imagine most of you out there have all played Micro Machines. I personally started on the Mega Drive, and if you're over in the States, you may have started on the Genesis, but it was on so many different systems. It's a great little top-down racer. It's such fun, especially in multiplayer. One of the best co-op competition games that you'll probably ever play. And if you haven't played this game, I swear you need to get out there, get some friends, get Micro Machines version 3 played, because it's absolutely brilliant. A Codemasters game from back in the day. And there's probably going to be more Codemasters games shown today. Nah, I can guarantee there'll be more Codemasters games shown today. But you're just going to have to wait to see them. But for this one, Micro Machines, V3 in the collection, it's fantastic. Go and get it, go play it if you've got it. Next up, we're staying with the same era, the same generation, but we're moving away from consoles and onto PC, because I did spend a lot of time in the early 90s playing on PC, and one game, or several games I had to pick up, was the Command & Conquer, the first Decade Edition. And as you can see from the back, this has got Command & Conquer, it's got Red Alert, it's got Generals, it's got all the games from that era, and I absolutely love these games. Now this particular one came with all the manuals which you'll need for the serial numbers, but it also came with this poster which I'll try and open up nice and gently so I don't tear it, because it's been in there for a few years, and there's that wonderful Command & Conquer poster. Now I'll put that away because this is Command & Conquer, a RTS game. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I love real-time strategy games. I know there's a lot of people who do and a lot of people that don't. I'll spend a lot of time with this, it's in the collection, I can do it when I like now. Next up, we're moving down a generation and we're moving back to Sega. So obviously the Mega Drive for me, and the Mega Drive that I picked up was Sword of Sodan. Now I know absolutely nothing about this game, I picked it up on a whim. It came in this interesting sort of clamshell case, probably ex-rental or something like that. It did have the manual with it, and of course I had to try and dig out this game from this wonderful packaging. It's in there really tight, just to show you that wonderful yellow tab from EA. It makes it so difficult to get into your cart, make sure everything's alright in there and clean it. But Sword of Sodan, I don't know, you'll have to drop into the comments and let me know if it's any good. It looks like a slash 'em up, a run and slash. It's in the collection now, I'll get to play it at some point. Next up, we're staying with Sega, but we're dropping down a generation to the wonderful Master System. And the Master System game that I picked up this last few weeks was Master of Darkness. Now again, I haven't played Master of Darkness, it's a game that passed me by. I do know it's a sort of Sega does Castlevania, and if you want to see any gameplay footage in this, I'm going to direct you over to Ollie 8-Bit Boy UK, because he's played this. He's the big Sega Master System guy. Well, him along with Clint from Retro Rewind. I don't want to leave out Clint. I don't want to start another war between these two guys. But Master of Darkness, been looking forward to getting this Castlevania game in. It's in now, I'll play it soon. Now next up we're going full retro. No, I don't even say retro, it's vintage, because it's games from the ZX Spectrum. Now many of you know that I did pick up a ZX Spectrum, it had a composite mod and a tape player. And these games I already had in my collection, but I had to pop along to eBay because unfortunately some of them didn't work, and this was 4 that didn't. Now as you can see there, we have Hungry Horace, Horace Goes Skiing, Chess and Checker Flag. Now with Hungry Horace and Horace Goes Skiing, they were a must get in and work in order, absolute must, there was no doubt about it. I've already done some videos on Hungry Horace, and I'm probably going to do some on the other games too. Maybe not chess, that's a little bit boring, but I needed to get these back into the collection. Now as for other videos that I'll be doing on the ZX Spectrum, I will definitely be doing more Horace stuff. There's another 2 games in the collection other than Horace which you've seen, because Horace Goes Skiing, Retro Ed absolutely loves that game. I'm going to do a video for Ed on that, and I think he'll like that. But it's good to have these back into the collection and in working order so I can load them up by tape and play when I want. Now next up, I'm staying with the ZX Spectrum, but I'm going to have to be a little bit quiet here because these games I picked up from Jace at retrogames.co.uk.
Hello, yes, it is me. It is Jace at Retro Games.
See, I knew I can't even whisper the name, and you summon him. He's like the Candyman of retro games, the first retro gamer. Well, so he claims anyway. But I did pop over to retrogames.co.uk, and yes, I'm not sponsored by Jace. He just has a wonderful service, and he's a great member of the retro video game community. And the first game that I bought off him was a game that I didn't have back in the day, but I think you're going to see why I picked it up. And that's obviously because it's a US Gold game. Well, no, obviously it's not. is because of this wonderful box art. Now, I don't know about you, but we just don't get box art like that anymore. I wish we did, but we don't. Now, inside, as you can see, it's a wonderful cassette tape, as most Spectrum games were, unless you were lucky enough to have the +3 later on. And it's also complete with its manual. Now, as I said, didn't play the Amazon women, the legend of the Amazon women back in the day. I was drawn to the box art, especially when I was reading about it in magazines, but it's in the collection. I'm sure I'll give it a go. I'm sure it's great. Next up, and still for the Specky, is a game that I pumped a lot of time in back in the day. It's a sports title, and it's one of the few sports that I like to play in video games. It's World Class Leaderboard, the outstanding golf game. And it definitely was a game that I put a lot of time into back in the day. Now, I do like a modern golf game, but my love for the modern golf games come from World Class Leaderboard. It's as simple as that. Now, playing this these days, it's probably a bit of a chore because it takes a long time to load a single hole, never mind the hole 18 in the course. When you're trying to play this game, you need a lot of time in your hands because it's old and it's beautiful and it plays remarkably well. That's one of the things about it though. The mechanics are fantastic in World Class Leaderboard. I'm glad it's back here. Now, next up is still for the Specky, and it's a bit of an oddity because this is a game that's a licensed game, but it's a product placement licensed game, and it's Clumsy Colin Action Biker by Skips. Now, if you don't know Skips, Skips are a corn snack over here in the UK anyway. Prawn cocktail flavour, quite like them, but they put out a game sponsored by Skips. I never understood it at the time. I don't think I even thought about it at the time. I was just happy to have a new game. Now, this particular game isn't very good. It's a Master on It game. They were the kings of the pocket money games, and look at that lovely yellow cassette. I mean, that's quite stunning. I quite like that. I like the attention to detail. Skips packets were yellow. Now, if you want to see gameplay of this Master on It game, then what I'm going to do is tell you to go over and look at jaethemanchild. There'll be a link in the description. He loves games like this. He loves really bad games from back in the day on the 8-bit micros that are linked to unusual sort of products or TV shows. So down in the description you'll have a link to Jay, and if he doesn't have this game played already, he'll probably play it after watching this. Next up, and still for the ZX Spectrum, we have a game that I played a lot of back in the day, and that is Super Robin Hood. And oh yes, to those Nintendo fanboys out there, Super Robin Hood. We were using Super games on the Spectrum long before the Super Nintendo even hit the shelves. Now, this is a classic 8-bit action platformer, and it's a thoroughly solid little experience. And to top it off, it's a game that wasn't going to break the bank for you, because if you take a close look down at the bottom, you'll see Codemasters, and Codemasters were one of the masters of the pocket money game back then, which meant that most libraries back then had a lot of codies in them. Up next, and still for the Specky, we have another sports title, and another sports title that I put a fair amount of time in back in the day, especially when I was around other friends, and that is Hardball. And to be perfectly fair, Hardball was probably my only experience when it came to baseball over here in Scotland. Of course, over here we played a similar game by the name of Rounders, so we did have a sort of idea of how the game should work, but when it came to actual baseball knowledge, we had absolutely no idea what we were doing other than throwing the ball and swinging that bat at the ball. Now, fortunately, that didn't take anything away from the game because it was a solid game. It plays really well, it still plays well today, and definitely one from my past that I'm happy to have back in the collection. Although I can definitely say that those screenshots in the back of this particular game are not Spectrum screenshots. There was a lot of little white lies back in the day when it came to these games, but it didn't take away any of the fun. I'm happy to have it back in the collection. I just need to find some friends who can maybe play some Hardball with me. Next up for the Spectrum is, yes, another odd little game, a game that doesn't really make much sense, not for a kid back in the day, and that game is Fruit Machine Simulator. Now, I would imagine most people know what a fruit machine is. It's a gambling machine. You put in some money, you spin the reels, and you hope they match so you can win some money back, and that's all this game is. Again, you can see it's a Codemasters game, so it was another pocket money game. It wasn't very expensive, but it was a game for some reason that me and my friends would put hours upon hours into, and there was nothing to it other than sitting there and trying to win more money to keep playing this fruit machine. I mean, what can I say? Kids are obviously easily entertained, or we certainly were back in the 1980s, and this game is a prime example of that. It's without a doubt the weirdest game that I ever played back in the day that got so much of my time. But I suppose simple things for simple minds, and that proves that adage. It's back in the collection now, and yes, I have played it again. Next up is one of my all-time favourite types of sports game, and that of course is the athletics or the track and field type sports games. And here I brought back in Daley Thompson's Decathlon. Now, for anyone who doesn't know Daley Thompson, if you weren't from the UK in the 90s you might not. He was an Olympian athlete, he took part in the decathlon, so the 10 sports, he was a multi-disciplined athlete, and his name of course would blend perfectly to a track and field clone game. And back in the 80s there was no real shortage of track and field games and track and field clone games, there was plenty of them. Now if you did play these games back in the day, you would know they were notorious for destroying joysticks or even keyboards. I played on the keyboard, not a joystick, and there's probably going to be some mention of joystick waggling later on in this video. Now I wouldn't say that Daley Thompson's Decathlon was one of my favourite of the track and field clone games. It was certainly up there, it was one of the first, it was the first I remember after track and field in the arcades, but there was better ones there. I did play it a lot, so it's in the collection now. Next up, and yes, still on the ZX Spectrum, is one of the oldest games that I've picked up in this particular bundle from the retrogames.co.uk. Again, not a sponsor, and that game is the outstanding Escape. And as I said, this is a very early game, and you can probably tell that from the wonderful box art. I mean, you just don't get box art like that anymore. There's just too much time and effort put into box art. This looks like a 15-year-old boy sat down in his bedroom and put this together, and that's what I like to see. Inside, however, the cassette, this really surprised me how well together this is put. You have the little dinosaur which chases you through the game, printed onto the actual cassette itself. It's not like a piece of paper. That really surprised me when I picked that cassette out there. But as you see, it's classic early 80s box art. It's a fantastic little game. It's from a company, New Generation Software, who coded for the ZX81, so they had a pedigree when it came to programming small video games back before anyone really knew what they were doing. But gameplay is king, and that's why it was in the collection, and it's back in the collection now. Next up for the ZX Spectrum is another game that I ploughed hundreds of hours into, or it felt like it was hundreds of hours back in the day, and that game is Harrier Attack. And probably one of the reasons that I spent so much time with Harrier Attack is simply because it had a lot of DNA from Defender, and Defender was one of my all-time favourite arcade games back in the early 80s. Harrier Attack was slightly different, of course. You didn't play the game in space, you were a Harrier, a jump jet Harrier. You took off from your aircraft carrier, you flew along the sea at low level where you could, trying to take out the enemy ships, and then you would reach land and try and take out all the enemy installations on the land. And let me tell you, this game was brutal. It did have settings for different levels, but even at the lowest level, this was a one hit, one death sort of game, like most of them were back then. Now if you want to see some footage of this game being played, I'm going to direct you to 8BitRach, who played it on the Amstrad CPC. Not as good a system as the ZX Spectrum, but hey, what can you do? We played with what we had back then, but Harrier Attack, absolutely love it, and it's definitely welcome back in the collection. Next up, and still for the Spectrum, is another track and field clone, but this one's pretty special because this is Ninja Master. Now of course, ninjas were one of the most important features of the 1980s. Everything had to be ninja or ninja themed. There was plenty of ninja video games, but look at this. This was a track and field style event game where you would deflect shuriken with your sword, You would do the chopping of the board, the karate chop. Not standard fare when it came to ninja games. This game was a joystick waggler, it was a keyboard pounder, it wasn't your run and slash, it wasn't your shinobi, it wasn't your Ninja Gaiden. This was completely different and it absolutely besotted me. I love Ninja Master. I was so happy to have it back into the collection. It's going to stay here forever. I have played it on the channel before and you can check that out in the A to Z of the spectrum, but it's back here and I'll be playing it again, guaranteed. Next up for the ZX Spectrum is yet another game that is very much UK centric and very much of its time, and that is the Adrian Mole computer game. Or more specifically in this case, the Adrian Mole Secret Diary kit. Now this particular box unfortunately doesn't have the diary in it, but that's okay with me because it was only really the game that I was after anyway. Now for anyone who doesn't know Adrian Mole's Secret Diary, well, it was a fantastic sort of teen young adult book written by Sue Townsend back in the early 80s, written in diary form, and it was very, very funny. It was also turned into a TV show at the time. And I know this particular box isn't probably in the best of states, but you know what? I might just watch some Tutti UK videos and see if I can get the old iron out and make this just a little bit more box-like. It was a game that I did play back in the day, don't remember too much, but I'm glad it's back with me now. Next up for the ZX Spectrum is a game that is an absolute banger. It's Uridium. Now, I don't know how many people out there have played Uridium. I know a lot of people know the Hewson label, but Uridium is a sort of isometric top-down shooter. It's kinda pseudo 3D and really, really quite clever for the time. Now, like the bulk of these games, I did buy it from Jace over at retrogames.co.uk. Still not a sponsor. Maybe he'll sponsor me later down the line, but he seems to think it plays better on the Commodore 64. Well, he's talking absolute guff, people. ZX Spectrum's the only way to go, because we all know everything plays better on a Speccy. Next up, we're moving away from the ZX Spectrum and onto a game that I've had for a while now and forgot to show off, and I don't quite know where to put it. As you can see, it's just a regular NES game until you turn it round and it's the Final Fantasy VII Remake. That's correct, people. One of those crazy coders out there has decided to take this game and throw it onto an 8-bit cartridge. I don't know how he done it, but I'm glad he did. The game is fantastic. I have taken it, I have dumped the ROM, put it onto my Steam Deck to play, so this is all good. If you want to see some footage of this, then I encourage you to go and see Dave over at David Retro Games Played Badly. He's got a much better video on it. I will put a link in the description for that. But look at this. This is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, or we should really say a demake, but it's better, and I dare I say it, it is much better than Final Fantasy VII Remake. Well, it is in my opinion anyway, and I just can't get over this wonderful NES cart that holds one of the greatest games of all time in an 8-bit form. So what do you think? I want you to drop into the comments, obviously, talk about this game. I hadn't even heard about it until Dave had mentioned it in one of his videos, and here it is in my hand and in my collection. Next up is a little bit of a Brucey bonus because it's not a game, it's a piece of hardware. It is a piece of hardware from 1996 and it's this wonderful Thrustmaster official Top Gun joystick. Now, I'm not going to lie, I do have a certain passion for peripherals. I mean, anything sort of hardware, especially if it's a little bit retro, a little bit vintage or classic, I absolutely love it. And you can't not love this Top Gun joystick. It's USB joystick, so you can plug it into modern machines, get your hands on it and just waggle away your joystick until your heart's content. Now, I think 005 Agima, that's my wonderful friend Chris over in Australia, the fake Australian because he's originally from England, he would probably love this thing. I probably won't use it despite how awesome it is, because I don't tend to play flight sims or games like that, but maybe I should try. Maybe I should dig out an old flight sim game on the PC, plug in this, I'll obviously have to get the drivers for it at some point, and see just how well the Top Gun joystick works. It's a solid piece of kit, it's really quite heavy as well. Happy to have it in the collection, it's such a lovely piece. Next up we have yet another Brucey bonus, and if you don't get the reference then you're probably not from the UK, you're probably maybe younger if you're from the UK, but Google Bruce Forsyth and find out what a Brucey bonus is. But this is definitely a Brucey bonus because I don't normally show physical media on the channel that's not a video game, and this is a wonderful water margin. Now I wouldn't imagine a great deal of you out there would know what the water margin is, and if you do, please drop down into the comments because I'd love to talk to you about it. But the water margin is a 1970s TV adaptation from Japan of a classic Chinese book. That classic Chinese book deals with the same subject as the water margin, and it follows the 108 heroes of the marsh. Now, when I say 108 heroes, you're probably going to start to click on, if you know me at all and if you know the channel, to why this is important to me, because 108 heroes equates to 108 stars, because this here is the story that Suikoden, or the Suikoden franchise, was based on. Now this particular box set here is DVD, and it's taken from VHS, so it's a VHS dumped onto DVD, so the quality is, let's say, well, what we remember from the early 80s through to the early 90s. Now yes, DVD didn't really hit the scene until the 90s, but of course technology got better, especially when it came to the production and reproduction of VHS tapes. But this here, it's just wonderful. It's the water margin, it's the story that inspired Suikoden. I couldn't be happier than to have this in the collection, and it's going to be here forevermore.
So there you go my friends, that was my mostly retro video games pickups from the last several weeks, and all thanks to Jen, who decided for some reason that I didn't pick up enough retro last time. Now if there's any of the games in there that you played back in the day and you want to talk about them, then drop that down into the comments, because the interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. Unless you're Jen, of course. But thank you again for watching, and until next time, cheerio!
If you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out the other ones in offer here, and also feel free to subscribe if you want to see more in the future.